Okay, Rabotai. This is the first part in the two-part series we're going to speak about Be'ezrat Hashem, about keeping Hadash in North America and particularly in America, where we're going to see there's a big difference between Hadash in America and Hadash in Canada. So today, the focus was going to be more on, no pun intended, planting the seeds to understand what the Masa Matan of the Sugya is regarding keeping Hadash in North America. And I'm sorry, keeping Hadash in general, and what's the minhag of the Sephardim in particular. And then we'll get to the dynamics of the flour market and the grain market in North America. How does it work? Because it's a particular situation that we're in. We're in a country with over 350 million people and grains that are planted throughout the year, and it really gets fascinating and complicated. So let us start with the following. It's written in the Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Lamed Vav Amud Bet, that Hadash, there are things that are noeg ben ba'aretz u ben b'chutz la'aretz, and Rabbi Elazar says in the Mishnah, Hadash noeg ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. That's the it seems to be the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, and there are different ra'ayot in the sugyot that this is how we are posek. I'm not going to get into all of the sugyot, but there's another sugya in Masechet Menachot that discusses what happens if you want to bring Hadash, if you want to bring a Korban Omer from Chutz La'aretz, and the Gemara seems to say it's dependent upon Rebbe Lazar, who holds that Hadash is noeg b'Chutz La'aretz. Then you could bring a Korban Omer from Chutz La'aretz, whereas if you're going to hold that Hadash is not noeg b'Chutz La'aretz, then you can't bring a Korban Omer. And it seems to be that the Stam Matnitin over there seems to hold that you can't bring a Korban in Chutz La'aretz. And the Gemara in Masechet Menachot, in the parak beforehand, discusses what happened. There were certain Tanaim that would eat Chadash b'chutz la'aretz, certain that wouldn't. And it seems to be the Netiya that in Shas there's different opinions. The Mishnah in Masechet Orla says Stama that Chadash is noeg ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz, and it seems to be from the Mishnah in Masechet Orla. It says it's a halacha, which means it would be on a deoraita level, like the Mishnah in Masechet Orla. So let's break down the shitot harishonim over here. The opinion of the Rif in Kiddushin, there's the Rambam in Ilchot Malachalot Asurot say that Chadash is noeg ben ba'aretz ben bechutz la'aretz mideoraita. They say clearly that Chadash is noeg ben ba'aretz ben bechutz la'aretz deoraita. Now, what they didn't mention, the Bach picks up on this. What they didn't mention is if Chadash is noeg by akum as well. Right? They don't mention the word akum. They say that Chadash is noeg ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz mideoraita, which pashtut would mean also ben ba'akum, but the Bach says no, they didn't write akum, so it is so by akum it's not noeg. The Rosh in his Teshuvot is mashma clearly that Chadash b'chutz la'aretz is deoraita would be even by akum. So you have the Gedolei Rishonim seem to, the Rif and the Rambam seem to say that Chadash b'chutz la'aretz is deoraita, and that's the Shulchan Aruch is posek in Yoredei Siman Resh Tzadi Gimel. The Riva, on the other hand, brought down in the Maram ben Baruch Siman Taf Ayin Gimel, the Or Zaruas in Shin Chav Chet. There's a Rabbeinu Simcha. There's the Marach Or Zaruas in Resh Yud Zayin, the Maril. A lot of we'll call them later Rishonim, all understand that Chadash and Chutz La'aretz is only derabanan. Chadash and Chutz La'aretz is not deoraita, it's derabanan. Okay? And that'll make a very big difference. The Aruch HaShulchan had a very big problem where he was living, which is in Rusland, in Russia, and the wheat in Russia inevitably was always Chadash, because the land was too difficult to plant. They didn't have winter wheat type of planting like they do nowadays. They weren't able to plant them, so inevitably the wheat that you always got in Russia was Chadash. So ask the Aruch HaShulchan, what are we supposed to do? Not have any food? Until came along the Or Zarua, and he proved that the Iker is not like the Mishnah in Masechet Orla that seems to say that Chadash Chutz La'aretz is the Oraita. Rather, the Iker is like what Masechet Menachot and the Aruch HaShulchan says, and he brings the Or Zarua, which the Or Zarua inside says, how do you know which stam matnitin to take? You have one stam matnitin in Orla that seems to say that Chadash Chutz La'aretz is the Oraita, and then you have another stam matnitin in Masechet Menachot that says that the Omer could only be brought from Eretz Yisrael, which seems to be that it's not noeg b'chutz la'aretz. So the Or Zarua says obviously the Mishnah in Menachot is ikar, because that's talking about the main sugya of Omer, whereas in Masechet Orla it was brought down derech agav. That's what the Or Zarua says, and therefore the Aruch HaShulchan says, because of this Or Zarua la tzaddik ul yishre lev simcha. That's how he quotes it. He was matzdik our minhag, since it's only derabanan, and therefore maybe it's not noeg bayas. He has a reason how to get out of the derabanan as well. But without the other zura, we would have starved. That's basically his mashmaut over there. So that's the second opinion. The third opinion is Rabbeinu Baruch, one of the Rishonim, brought down in the Teshuvot of the Rosh. And he says that that Chadash in Chutz La'aretz is derabanan, but not only that, the Gzeira of derabanan is only be'artzot asmuchin le'er Yisrael, like Mitzrayim, Ammon, Moav, and Bavel. But very far out places, it's not even asur b'derabanan. This is also the opinion of Tosfot Tuch in Masechet Kiddushin Daf Lamed Zayin. The Magen Avram in Siman Taf Peitet is meyashiv the minhag ha'olem al pi des Rabbeinu Baruch. So that's a very strong opinion. The fourth opinion is the Ritzba. The Ritzba holds that Chadash is noeg b'chutz la'aretz, but only a Jew's tvua. A goy's tvua is not noeg b'chutz la'aretz. But in Eretz Yisrael, whether it's a Jew or a non-Jew's tvua, you have to keep Chadash, and this is brought down in the Pirushim Upsakim of Rabbeinu Avigdor Tzarfati in Parashat Emor. Fifth opinion is the Bach. The Bach has a long arichut in Yoredei Siman Reish Tzadi Gimel. How is it that he saw Gdolei Olam, including the Rav of the Shach and the Maharal and all great Rabbanim, that they would be lenient on Chadash? And he says, obviously we understand that Chadash of Goyim, of Akum, is not Noeg. But not only that, so what's the difference in the his sheet and Rabbeinu Ritzba? It's not Noeg by Goyim, Bein Ba'aretz, Bein B'chutz La'aretz. That means even in Eretz Yisrael, if it's Chadash of Goyim, it's not Noeg. That's the Bach's opinion. And he says he ran this by the Gedolei Ador of his time, and they were maskim, and therefore, says the Bach, anybody who's machmir berabim in front of his rebbeim, it's yoara. He's not allowed. Not allowed to be machmir in front of his rebbeim. He's very strong about that. So these are 5 opinions. Now, just before we continue, what would be the reason why you can't eat chadash? What's the reason of the Torah says, Lechem v'keli v'karmel lo tochleu ad etz yom hazeh. You're not allowed to eat grain that was planted after Pesach unless the Omer is brought. Why? So the Sefer HaChinuch says because lechem is the ikar michyato shel adam, and it's not ra'i for us to partake in our grains until it's brought to Hashem first. That's the kavanat Torah. Not that we paskin according to kavanat Torah, but just to give us a little bit of an understanding of this isur and how it could be even an isur deoraita according to the Rishonim, whether you're in Aretz, whether you're in L'chutz La'aretz. So Lema'aseh, we have a machloket over here whether Chadash is mideoraita or miderabanan. Now, this would seem to be clear cut for Sfaradim that Chadash is asur deoraita, and nothing to talk about. Shulchan Aruch brings it down, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, the Shalosh Gedolei Poskim, and the Shulchan Aruch doesn't really give any way out. Where is our Hachra'at hasugya over here. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Let me just. I forgot to bring two Sfarim. There's you know where the tour is? Arbaturim Yoredeya. Yoredeya. It's in Siman Reish Tzadi Gimel, and also the Shulchan Aruch Yoredeya Siman Reish Tzadi Gimel.
That's the
Yoredeya. You'll see where it's between Siman this and this. Siman Reish Tzadi Gimel. So this is where we start getting into a question. What is the Masoret HaPsak in Klal Yisrael? And this is where we really are presented with a fascinating dilemma that we have what's written in the Sfarim, and then what was Noheg. And this requires Shibush Chachamim. This requires Shibush Chacham. So let's start. One thing I want to start and say clearly is that if we are noket, that Hadash is the oraita, legamre, and that's how not only we follow those psakim, but we implement them halacha lema'aseh, that I should be noheg, I should be noeg, that Hadash is an isur de oraita, so I shouldn't be able to walk into any kosher establishment anytime, because that would be called a double standard. Hare, if you would tell me that I could go to a restaurant, give me a restaurant in Great Neck, for example. What restaurant do you want? Restaurant.
Shiraz.
What?
Shiraz.
Shiraz. Let's say you go to Shiraz. Say, listen, there's a restaurant called Shiraz. In this restaurant, they have a corner where sometimes they serve shrimp, but most of the time it's like we make sure not to separate, and we'll give you the non-shrimp option. I would never step foot in such an establishment, and neither would you, because if something is a vaday trefot, I'm going to start playing with fire. There's bittul over there. There's no bittul. There's the kalim. I would never be. And not only that, even if it's not Hadash season, but it's a kitchen that had trefot 3 months ago, and they never koshered the kitchen, I would never have the audacity to eat there. So I'm trying to lay down a very important. Oh, thank you. That's the tour. I need a Shulchan Aruch now. A tour and a Shulchan. Yeah, thank you. So obviously, the number one hanacha that we should really think about is that if you want to say that you're noeg a chumrah for Chadash, that's one thing. But if you want to say that no, Chadash is asr for Sephardim and for Ashkenazim, or for Sephardim for sure, so basically you're putting yourself in a situation that it will inevitably mean that you're being hypocritical, unless you're like the Gaon Mivilna and the Shagat Aryeh, that they were very big proponents of keeping Chadash, and when they went to Galut, when the Gra went to Galut, he took his kalim along with him. He took his kalim along with him because the kalim are usher because of Chadash, right? So unless you take your kalim wherever you go, and it could be you do, I don't know, but whoever doesn't take their kalim with them, whoever eats in any establishment outside of their house throughout the year and eats processed foods, is vaday not being noeg that Chadash is a Isser vaday. Okay? So when you start with that, what was the Masorah by the Ashkenazim? The overwhelming majority of the Ashkenazim throughout the generations were lenient like the Bach. The Aruch HaShulchan, as I mentioned, brought this down. The Taz, the Magen Avram, the Pnei Yeshua at Masechet Kiddushin has a Kuntras Achron where he writes also to support the Bach. The Shav Yaakov and Siman Mem Aleph, the Knesset Yecheskel and Siman Mem Aleph, they were all machriya to be mekel. The Chok Yaakov as well, the Chidush Yarim, Avnei Nezer, the Chelkat Yoav. Thank you very much. This is the Masor by the Ashkenazim that they went with this opinion of the Bach. The Gra was Machmir, and the Maaseh Rav writes in the Gra and the Shulchan Aruch writes Kipshuto that it seems to be, that like the Shulchan Aruch. And then Maaseh Ravi writes even the Kalim should be Aser. It's interesting though, the Shagat Aryeh also in Dinei Chadash is Machmir. But it's funny that the Maritzins in Siman Taf Peitet, Magena Elef writes that even the Amudei HaOra, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, Ilu Amit Pashet Aminag B'Yameim Le'akel B'Chadash B'Chutz La'aretz, Lo Hayu Ma'amidim Divrem Levatel Aminhag. If the minhag to be makel on Chadash and Chutz La'aretz was also in their time, they wouldn't have been ma'amid the minhag to ad kedei kach to be machmer. So that's also very interesting. Not only that, in the Sefer Ma'aseh Rav Shalem, he has the Hagaot from a Sefer Or Chadash. The Rab Chaim Mivolozhin, a student obviously of the Gaon Mivilna, allowed selling Chadash to those who ate Chadash on their table. And the Mishkenot Yaakov also in Yoredeya writes, Shamati ze rabot b'shanim mipe kadosh mori v'Rabbi Gaon Rav Chaim Volozhin she'amar b'shem achiv Gaon HaMefuzar Rav Shlomo Zalman she'amar lelamed zchut al minhagam shel olam lakel b'chadash. So you see that was the minhag. Not only that, in Lita, which was the mikomo shel Gaon Mivilna, there is a sefer called Kodshei Yisrael Chelek Hey that brings an edut from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky that only in 2 places in Lita they would be noeg like the Gra. The Gra had a lot of shitot. One of them was to make a bracha on the Megillot ala Klaf. And he says only in 2 places, in Volozhin and in Slobodka, two Batei Knesset there, they would be noeg like the Gra. But Chadash and Chutz La'aretz, they were mekel, even in Lita. So where is our push to be machmir nowadays? Our push mainly comes from the Chafetz Chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol yamid baruch.
Amen.
Where does our push to be machmir come from? From the holy Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim in Siman Taf Peitet writes that, he doesn't understand what should be the leniencies and who people should be somech on to be lenient regarding Chadash if all the poskim say that it's asur. And not only that, he says also Sheikhar, Yain Saraf, and Pleitat Kalim, all should be a problem. But in the Bir Halacha, he says something where I think this whole shir is going to be based on, and this is going to be our guiding light. The Bir Halacha says, it's very interesting. How come nobody is machmir, says the Bir Halacha? And he says, V'hu davar kashe lizar b'mididot al ken, somech kol echad al minhag ha'olam le'akil legamrei. Says like this. Since it's something so hard to be noeg on Isra Chadash, since it's something that's so difficult to be machmir, so people said it's an all or nothing game. Aval ani udati en nachon hadavar. Says the Bir Halacha, why should it be an all or nothing? Somebody doesn't keep Shabbat. So he says, I don't keep Shabbat. I've had it all this time. Somebody comes to me, I don't keep Shabbat. Let me open up the lights for you. No, that's not how it works. You try to keep whatever you can. Even if you turn on the lights 10 times on Shabbat, you cut it down to 5 times, that's already a big deal. Just because it's difficult for you to follow all the chumrot, you should be lenient all the time. And therefore, according to the Bir Halacha, we have a mahalech to try to be machmir on Chadash as much as we can, where we can, but that doesn't mean that we should give up totally. Now, how about the Gedolei Sfaradim? How did they opine on this issue? What did the Gedolei Sfaradim follow? Interesting, there are not many teshuvot from the Sfaradim written on Isur Chadash b'chutz la'aretz. The Rav Chaim ben Atar, the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, in his Sefer Rishon LeZion in Yoredeya, argues on the Bach. He doesn't accept the Bach's kula. And the Birkei Yosef of the Chida has a long arichut about the Bach. Not very clear how he ends off. He has certain kushot, certain rayot. It's not very clear how he leans. Because if you would accept the Bach, you could say that it's not against the Shulchan Aruch and the Bet Yosef, because the Shulchan Aruch was saying Chadash is chutz la'aretz is noeg, but the Rambam never said b'shel akum. So the Rambam never said b'shel akum. I should correct myself. The Shulchan Aruch does say b'shel akum it's noeg. So no, you're stuck with the Shulchan Aruch. You're stuck. The Shulchan Aruch's lashon is Yisra Chadash ben bar chutz ben shel ben shel akum. The Rambam, you could say that the Rambam left out the word akum, but in the Shulchan Aruch you'd be stuck. So basically, even the Bach wouldn't help for the Sfaradim. So the Stei Chemed in Asifot Dinim, he brings a lot of different teshuvot of Hadash. He doesn't really bring Sfaradim, but the question is, why did the Sephardim not speak about this Isser Hadash? Did they keep away from Hadash the whole year? So my theory, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is that the Sephardi countries were much warmer than the Ashkenazi countries, and therefore their planting season was during the winter. For example, if you look up what the grain planting season in Morocco is, you'll see that it goes throughout the winter. We'll clarify this more when we discuss how the Mitziut works by Hadash, but anything that was planted during the winter will by default always be Yashan. It's never going to have a halachic issue to it, because by the time you harvest it, Pesach is going to come. So all Hadash all wheat that is being planted in Morocco, and in many countries, like France right now is that way, and Hungary, Italy, the majority of, or I would say almost all of their wheat is Yashan by default. They don't wait to plant it till April, May, after Pesach, and they harvest it first. So it could be that they never really had to deal with this issue. Notwithstanding, there is a Talmid Chacham in Eretz Yisrael called Reb Shlomo Zalman Revach, who is Rev Shneur Zalman Revach, who heads the Machon Mitzvot HaTluyot Ba'aretz. It's a Talmud of Rav Shlomo Amar, and he says, Zochreni shera'iti le'agod Rabbi Shalom Mesas, שכתב שבמרוקו מעולם לא בירו הדגנים שהגיעו מחוץ לארץ עם חדש או ישן. He says he saw one place that in Morocco they never separated between the deganim of chutz la'aretz of chadash or yashan. Also Rabbi David Banon from Montreal told me this as well, that he heard from Rabbi Shalom Mesas that chadash wasn't noeg. But it's not clear what the nusach, that Shalom Mesas never wrote about this. Did he mean to say that it's not noeg like the Bach, that we're just not knowing like the Bach, or that usually it wasn't a problem, or because of Sfekot? Very difficult to understand what would be the heter. I mean, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch Baruch Toledan, who brings the halacha of Hadash, and he doesn't bring the kula of the Bach. So it's really hard to know. There's a Shilot Uchivot Simchat HaKohen, Rav Rachamim Chai Chwita HaKohen, one of the Rabbanim of Jerba, that's in Tunisia, and he writes that although the Minag Pashut is to forbid Chadash, but there are Sfekot to be makel, and he endorses Sfekot that we will discuss in a moment. Also, Or Litzion, the Rav Ovadia, they don't give a blanket heter to say that Chadash is allowed based on the Ashkenazi poskim like the Bach, but they also have a hard time saying that it's forbidden Me'ikaradim. And this is going to bring us to the second subject, which is Al Korchach. There is a mitziut that the Shulchan Aruch forbade Chadash on one hand. On the other hand, what would be certain leniencies in order to navigate this difficult sugya? So what I do want to point out before we continue is that even though we don't have any of the Gedolei Sfaradim that specifically say that Chadash is allowed, and this Shmua from Rabbi Shalom Mesas is not very clear what he meant, that we weren't noig that way. Does it mean we weren't noig that way because it wasn't shayach, it wasn't relevant in their cities or not? But nevertheless, nobody specifically came out and said, we starve until we find an Eitzah. Nobody came out and said, we starve until we find an Eitzah. Maybe they never had to starve because they always had Yashan, but nobody really talked about that. Well, if it gets mixed in our Kalim, or one time if you do bring Chadash, it's going to be Aser. So, the Rama, the Shilotu Tshuvot HaRosh, and the Rama brings the Shilotu Tshuvot HaRosh, writes, and it's written really in the Bet Yosef, writes a few leniencies. I'm going to say now 5 or 6 different leniencies that could be implemented whenever one is learning the sugya of Hadash. And this really has to do with Yoredea Siman Kuf Yud of Ilchot Sfekot. Number 1, the Rosh writes about a certain case that they had regarding beer. His specific case was writes about seorim, about barley, and he doesn't get yet about beer, but he just talks about seorim, and he says, number 1, if you have rov yashan, you're for sure okay. Even though the minority is not that way, you go according to rov, according to the Torah. Second of all, if you're going to have a suffix, you could rely that it's a sfeik sfeika. What's the sfeik sfeika? Suffix, it was tvua from last year, last year's tvua. And even if you want to say it's tvua of this year, maybe it was tvua that was planted before the Omer. And tvua that was planted before the Omer is nitar. That's the Rosh Migdolei Rishonim writes this suffix safika. Now, whoever hears the sfeik sfeika, and you hear Lomdim talk about the sfeik sfeika, they say, oh, it's not a sfeik sfeika, because it's a sfeik sfeika mishem echad. Anybody learned Masechet Keduvot Daf Tet knows that a suffix that's of one shem, sfeik sfeika mishem echad, is not called a suffix. And over here as well, what does it make a difference if it was last year's tevuah, this year's tevuah, or this year's tevuah was planted before the Omer? Planted before the Omer is also last year's tevuah. What's the difference? The Rebbe Akiva Eiger brings this in the name of the Mutzel Me'esh of Alfandri, who asks this question. And he says, it should be a Safek Mishem Echad, Migdolei Sephardim, Rav Alfandri, Mutzel Me'esh, asks this question. And he says, he leaves it as a question. But Lehalacha, all of the Rishonim, the Acharonim, they wrote this. I mean, the Rosh wrote this Safek, the Tur brings it down, the Ramah brings it down, the Bet Yosef brings it down, he doesn't argue on it. So nobody had this question of Sfeik Sfeika Mishem Echad. And there's many answers to this question. The Chavodat in Siman Kuvav writes that Safek Mishem Echad doesn't apply when it's a Safek in Mikrim, Safek in scenarios. It's 2 different scenarios. Could be this bundle of wheat from last year or another bundle that was planted before. It's 2 different bundles. It's not, Sfeik Mishem Echad is on dinim, it's the same din. But here it's 2 different mitziyut. So what if it sounds similar, but it's 2 different animals? The Kreti Upleti brings from the Marami Hamburg that if it's Omer from this year, then it's matir all the minim. So it matir a much more extensive. It's matir much more extensive heter than Chadash from last year. Chadash from last year is matir last year's tevuah. This is matir everything around it. But the truth is, there's a Marit al-Ghazi in Masechet Bechorot, Perik Bet, Ot Yudal, Yud Zayin, one of the Gedolei Sfaradim. They say Reb Chaim Brisker's Shita was based on the Marit al-Ghazi. And there he has done that in order to say Sfeik Sfeika Mishem Echad, he has a whole discussion regarding kinyanim and sfekot. But he writes, as long as there's a little bit of a shinui in mitziyut, it's called a sfeik sfeika. And here the Aruch HaShulchan says you have a little bit of shinui between one suffix and the other. Why? Because the second suffix, you're saying that it's tevuah from this year, but it was nishur lifnei ha'omer. This suffix has something the other suffix doesn't have. This suffix you could bring a korban from this tevuah. Last year's tevuah you can't bring a korban with. This year's tevuah you could bring a korban. So since there's a shinui, that's already enough to say it's not sfeik sfeika mishem echad. This is all besides the fact that the Shitat Rambam argues on the whole premise that sfeik sfeika mishem echad is a problem. The Tosfot held the way the Rambam didn't hold that it's a problem. Brought down in the Ran Daf Tet Amud Bet says that sfeik sfeika mishem echad is fine. So sfeik sfeika mishem echad, yet when you hear people talk about it, you have to understand it's a question that there are many answers to. And the Gedolei Rishonim, the Ramah, and the Bet Yosef all brought it down. So if you have this sfeik sfeika, you could definitely rely on it and implement it. We'll discuss next shiur whether it's applicable nowadays, but you definitely have that. I want to lay down a few other yesodot. Number 2 is there's a fascinating Bet Yosef. The Bet Yosef brings from the Beit Yosef brings from the Hagot Maimoniyot. The Hagot Maimoniyot writes that in Tarmanzia they would plant oats after Pesach. Listen to this. Mikol makom, nevertheless, kivan she'en daltot hamedinot ne'ulot, since the doorways of the country are not locked, that means there's exporting and importing happening. And you could bring from other places that they reap before Pesach. It's mutter, mashma. It's mashma that he'd rather not say it's aser. And this would seem to be the ikar lehalacha. That if you have an option that it might have came beforehand, it doesn't say rov could come before. They plant rov afterwards, but you have a heter of tolin. And the Beit Yosef brings down this heter, and he doesn't seem to argue on it. And the Levush explains this way as well, that it's you have a tliya. If you have a tliya even on deoraita, it seems to be that it works. So we talked about rov, we talked about sfeika, we talked about the heter tolin. A fourth suffix that we could speak about here as well is the poskim discuss what happens if you have a sfeika that's not a suffix as shakul. The second suffix is not equal. The Pri Hadash in your Edei Siman Kuf Yud says sfeika sheino shakul works. Why? Because the whole premise of sfeika is you have one suffix makes it palgo palga. So the second suffix just has to tip the scale. So even if it's 5%, 10%, it tips the scale. Right? So over here as well, as long as you have a little bit that tips the scale, it should be okay. A lot of the Shav Shmata argues on this. In Shmata Aleph, Perik Yud Chet, he says that it has to be Sfeikot Shkulim, because it's called Rov Tzdadim. You have to have each tzad has to be a healthy tzad. But really, you can't have a suffix she'eino shakul. But there are poskim that say even a suffix she'eino shakul is okay. There's besides the Pri Hadash, there's a Sidrei Tara in Siman Kuf Pei Gimel. There's a Kesef Mishnah in Isurei Bia Legabek Tamim. That's mashma that even if it's a suffix she'eino shakul, you could rely on that it could be okay. So suffix she'eino shakul, according to some poskim, works. A fourth point to put out over here. A fifth point to put out over here is that any sfeika, if you could be mevarer it, is it still called a sfeika? So you have some poskim that'll tell you, oh well, if you could be mevarer the suffix, it's not called a sfeika. So you have to understand that statement is not accurate. Number one, the Shach writes in Klali Sfeikzavot Lamidei writes that you should be machmir if it's not a hefsid merube by a sfeika that you could be mevarer. But me'ikar adin, it's still called a sfeika. And the Shara Melech proves this from many places, that since sfeika is like rov, or maybe it's better than rov, just like rov you don't have to be mevar, sfeika also you don't have to be mevar. And therefore, the Gaon Mivilna writes in Yoredei Siman Kuf Chav Bet, Stam kelim einam b'nei yomam. If you have a keli, you could assume it's not b'nei yomam. Why? So Tosfot says because it's a sfeika. Safek, maybe it was used today or yes. Even though it's used today, but it could be it's pagum. It could be it's pogim the machal. So even though you could be mavar, you could ask the guy, maybe you used it within 24 hours. Says the gra nirali the sfeiko v'avagav shel sholo kivin the sfeika mutter. Even if you could ask the person, it's still a sfeika. So the shach says to be machmir, to ask people when you're able to, but that definitely doesn't take away the validity of the sfeika. So that's also something important. Another important detail, fifth detail, is that when you have three sfeikot, it's more lenient. The shach writes in close sfeik zayin that regarding Sfei Sveika Makam Chazaka, if it has 3 Sveikas, it's more Mekel. So that's also something important. And the last Sad is Davar Sheyesh Lo Matirin. You see, it's a big diun whether Hadash is called a Davar Sheyesh Lo Matirin. The Gemara Masechet Nedarim called Daf Nun Chet Amud Bet calls Hadash as a Davar Sheyesh Lo Matirin. The Mordechai ignores this Gemara and he seems to say that Hadash is not called a Davar Sheyesh Lo Matirin because it's Chozer Li Isuro next year. And the Poskim discuss what's Pshat in the Mordechai. But just to mention that although the Taz writes that a dough that has Chadash in it is a Davar Sheyesh Lo Matirin, it's not Batel, but the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Graz, at the end of his Sefer, Teshuvot, Siman Chaf writes that if it's Chametz, you have to get rid of it before Pesach, right? So there's not going to be any Matirin, because you have to get rid of it. So therefore it's Ein Lo Matirin. And Rova Poskim, that's how they follow I'm not going to count all the Poskim that writes that it's allowed, but basically anything that is going to be Chametz, and wheat nowadays, regular wheat is usually, it had water soaked in it. The flour that we have on the market is definitely chametz gamur. So flour that we have on the market is also called davar sheyesh lo matir. One last thing is that I saw poskim say, I saw rabbanim say, rabbanim that current modern day rabbanim, that they say that you can't rely on sveika by chadash, because it's a suffix asui lishtanot. It's a suffix that's made to change. Because, during the season, when you go later on in the season, it's going to be a different scenario. That is a statement that is based on the Ran in the Bet Yosef, brought down in the Bet Yosef and Even Ezer Siman Memhei, regarding the minhag, whether when a woman receives savlonot gifts, is that considered a chashash kiddushin or not? And whether to determine whether it's a kiddushin or not, what was the minig when they gave the savlonot? So says the Ran, you can't determine what the minig because it's asui lishtanot. So over here too, it's asui lishtanot, you can't rely on it. Lechora, that sugya is determining what the minig is. And if it's a minig, it's always made to change, you can't consider it as a minig. But by a sveika regarding chadash, it has nothing to do with ishtanot. Either you have the mitziyut that it's a sveika, either you don't. It's very simple. If you have the suffix around, you could rely on it. If you don't have the suffix around, you can't rely on it. The Rosh makes a sveika, he doesn't call it asud ishtanot. So those are a few important details that are important to speak out. Now that we reach this level, that we're ready to go to halacha lema'aseh, and that's going to be for next week. We already finished for this week's part 1. Part 1, basically, we mentioned that the poskim say that chadash is noeg ben baretz ben chutz laaretz. Many rishonim say not that way. The minig in Ashkenaz was to be mekel, and even by Sfarad, we're going to see that despite the fact that lechaora, it seems to be like Shulchan Aruch, it's asur, but the Bet Yosef brings many sfikot. He brings sveika, he brings rov, he brings the heter of tolin, and we discussed on our own that there could be sveikas of if it's eno shakul. We wrote about that it's even if it's 3 sveikots you could rely. So because of all of these details, we're going to speak about next week. Ad kedei kach how much you could be mitzaref. I just want to end off the following. The Rav Simchat HaKohen of the Rav from Jerba is mitzaref the Bach as a sfika. Rav Ben Zion Bashol also brings the Bach to rely on sfika. He says regarding Shabbatot. There's Yalkut Yosef from Rav Yitzchak Yosef also is mitzaref the Bach as a sfika. So there's many prominent Sephardic poskim from previous generations, and even Sephardic rabbanim of generations nowadays that are mitzaref the Bach as a sfika and didn't close the door totally to say that there's no heter whatsoever. So based on this, we're going to discuss if the sfikot are noeg, and we're going to present next week be'ezrat Hashem yitbarach a practical way how to keep yashan for somebody who's not ready to commit fully to all the lists. That's going to be next week be'ezrat Hashem. Chazak u'baruch.